I'm Paul Lewis-Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins. Thank you for joining us for another session in New Wine Tastings, where we're seeking to give a taste of new wine, new wineskins. It's a privilege for me to introduce to you Mr. Rodney Clapp. Rodney is an editor at Cascade Books in Eugene, Oregon, and the founding editor of Brazos Press at Baker. He is a prolific author. His works include the best-selling or the award-winning A Peculiar People, The Church as Culture in a Post-Christian Society, Tortured Wonders, Christian Spirituality for People, Not Angels, and New Creation, a primer on living in the time between the times. His most recent book, right here, great cover, by the way, is titled Naming Neoliberalism, Exposing the Spirit of Our Age, Fortress Press, 2021. Rodney, thanks for joining me here at New Wine Tastings.
It's great to be with you, Paul. Thanks for having me.
And I should add before we begin this session that Rodney has also edited two of my books. He's one of my favorite editors. He's just phenomenal as an editor. So if you're looking for a book editor, Rodney's the one. And but the book I wrote with my former friend, Brad Harper, partner in crime, actually still good friends. He works with me at New Wine, New Wineskins, but Exploring Ecclesiology, an Evangelical and Ecumenical Introduction, and then more recently, Setting the Spiritual Clock, Sacred Time Breaking Through the Secular Eclipse. So Rodney, thanks for all you do, and even in helping me learn how to write.
Well, you're very welcome, Paul, and it's been a pleasure to work with you and very edifying.
Oh, thank you. So Rodney, as we deal with the book, Naming Neoliberalism, maybe we'll ask about the cover design too. That's worth consideration. But could you define for us neoliberalism, please?
Yeah, I devote an entire chapter of the book to trying to sketch out in some detail what neoliberalism is and going into some of the history of it. But in terms of a fairly succinct definition, I would say that neoliberalism is a cultural and political economic panoply of practices that put all of society underneath and to be controlled by the market. So neoliberalism holds up the market as that which defines all of our lives. It doesn't see the market as an important, but just a part of or sector of our lives, but sees it as the reigning umbrella, if you will, or the walls around the castle and the moat that constrain and direct and channel our lives. So that would be my short definition. There's much to unpack about that, but basically making the market the arbiter of all of our social lives.
And to that point, and as you say, I believe in the book that many scholars from different disciplines are coming out to highlight this. Yours is a particular theological, ethical discourse addressing it, but I think of Michael Sandel at Harvard in his well-known book, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. And he doesn't have problems with the free market economy, but he says a free market society is a completely different thing where the only thing that has value is that which the market frames as valuable. And Jonathan Sachs, the famed rabbi of the United Kingdom, he wrote about this in First Things. And then I think Gordon Bigelow critiquing evangelicalism in Harper Magazine back in 2004, that we do not realize as evangelicals, my brand, so to speak, of Christianity, how framed we are by market ideology. It shapes us. It's our creation narrative, our theodicy, he says, in critiquing evangelicalism. So I just think that relates to some of what you're saying, but you're, of course, developing it in a particular way, which we're going to unpack further. Anything further to that with some of the literature before I get into some more of these questions?
No, I think you're exactly right. The people you've named, and there are a host of others, sociologists, philosophers, theologians to some degree, Activists, Occupy Wall Street would be an example of some people who recognize the lineaments of what I'm calling neoliberalism and protested against it. We can, name any number of people, and I rely on a lot of work that comes well before my book, in trying to identify and critique neoliberalism.
With that, and what's, I think, distinctive of your enterprise is, again, that you're framing it in many ways as a rival theology as well as ethic. How is it a rival theology to Christian theology as well as an ethic, Rodney?
Neoliberalism does not see a place for embedding the market within wider society, within a wider spirituality and morality. Let me pause there just to say that I'm not at all arguing in the book that we should try to eliminate markets. The markets are something that most cultures have a place for. Even some forms of state-directed communism, like current day China, have a place for markets. I'm not at all, and down through history, there's been a place and a role for the market in human life. So I'm not at all in the book arguing against markets per se, or arguing that we should eliminate all markets. My problem in the way in which neoliberalism is a rival theology to Christian orthodoxy is when the market is seen as the arbiter of all of life, and when everything has to, or is supposed to, answer to the market, be filtered through the market. So it's a rival theology in the sense, as I was saying just a moment ago, in the sense that it tries to say there's no place for morality and spirituality, that all of these have to be subordinated to the market. And it has its own eschatology, or understanding of the end and goal of humanity, in the sense that it holds that the best that we can do is let the market rule over all of our lives and subject everything, as Michael Sandel argued, to marketplace pricing and so on and so forth. So it is a rival theology and has been recognized as such by no lesser a luminary than Pope Francis, who actually very sharply said that one can't be both a Christian and a neoliberal.
Striking to say the least. And with that, and as I'm teaching theology classes, I think, your work has a real bearing on what we do in systematics, because it's harder and harder, I think, with students to really, right out of the gate, invite them into conversation about questions like what is true, what is good, what is beautiful. Almost always, I think, questions like what is useful, what is efficient, what is affordable drives the conversation. So it takes a lot of work just to get up to speed to ask some of those questions that Plato was after. And I think historic Orthodox Christianity from its own vantage point is asking, but like Jacques Ellul in Technological Society, what is efficient? It's kind of a precursor, but it's what is useful, what is affordable, what is useful are the questions that so often shape people. And I think that really frames things in a very problematic direction to get at those ultimate theological and ethical questions. So what do you think about that, Rodney? That even the questions we ask are often not framed by way of Christian Orthodox theology.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. We have been so molded by neoliberalism, which has been a governmental force since at least the 1980s, with the ascension of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, where neoliberal policies were put into place. And we have been so formed since at least the 1980s by a vocabulary and an understanding, a social imaginary of neoliberalism, that we don't know what to do with goods that can't be subordinated to price and have a cash value put on them. And so subsequently, what the neoliberals, the theorists, argued is that we simply need to ignore those values for the most part, those goods like truth. And an example of vocabulary, Paul, I think comes from our drafting of even family life, parents and children and mates, in terms of the marketplace. So we talk about investing and time investments in our marriage. We talk about how our children have to be from an early age getting into the best kindergarten and pre-kindergarten schools in order to go to the best colleges, 15, 20 years down the line. And so even something like family, which is a good for many, if not most people, is run through the ringer and through the filter of neoliberalism and made into something that we try to see in terms of how productive it makes us. One of the things I argue in the book is about how under neoliberalism, each of us becomes an entrepreneur of self. And we talk about our personal brand, and we spend time on social media very carefully curating how we will appear to others and hoping to make ourselves to employers more marketable or more attractive, and to increase our social capital with people around us, friends and acquaintances alike. So
networking is a code word for a lot of that.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. It makes it very difficult with that kind of understanding of the economy to introduce truth, to introduce goods like beauty that can't have a price put on it. And indeed, our very closest relationships, like those of family, are constrained and in some ways shrunken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you think about the gospel, for example, we're going to get into that further. I mean, Jesus leaving the 99 to go after the one. I mean, it's like, how is that a good investment, return on investment? In my estimation, it just seems so counterintuitive to this kind of framework that you're drawing attention to with neoliberalism. And, the family, we think about immigration issues, merit-based immigration, which really arose in that same time of Reagan and Thatcher, as I think. Maybe it precedes it, but really came to the foreground, and it's more recent too. And I think that merit-based immigration, it's not based on need. It's not based on the family. The Roman Catholic Church would always say, I think it would go based to need, back to need. And for them, certainly family, keeping families together and that connection. But it's often lost in many contexts today, even in Christian circles. It's the water we drink, the air we breathe, and we're not even aware of it. And that takes us to the next question. Why is neoliberalism so hidden and so unassuming? Or is it better to say that it likes to remain hidden, that there's almost like a desire for neoliberalism, those forces, to remain hidden? And if so, why is it so secretive? And so much so that Christian witnesses must do the hard work of naming, unmasking, and disarming neoliberalism.
I think part of it, Paul, is catching up. It takes a while for us to understand cultures that we're swimming in, like fish in the water. And neoliberalism, while it has historical and theoretical roots that go back beyond the 1980s, has as a power been with us basically about 40 years now. Now, in one way, that's a long time. In another way, it's not such a long time. Cultures, even in a fast moving and fast developing world like our own, take a while to be recognizable. And I think what we're seeing now is that neoliberalism has reached a point where it is recognizable. Its promises that this is the best that we could do for the society and for the globe um, are being seen to be threadbare. And we have a younger generation that's saying, wait a minute, we can't afford housing, we can't afford education, we can't afford some very basic goods in our lives. What maybe the overweening cultural powers aren't working so well for us. I think early on, people were ready to think that perhaps what neoliberalism promised were attractive. Neoliberalism, after all, talks a lot about freedom. Now, mainly it speaks about a kind of freedom from. It promises, wants to talk a lot about the free market, doesn't necessarily ask who the market is free for and for whom it is freeing, but it talks a lot about freedom and did that early on. And in the days of the Soviet Union falling, the Berlin Wall coming down, and a kind of a democracy seeming to be promoted around the world, that keystone of freedom was very attractive, and understandably so. But neoliberalism early on talked a lot about freedom and its particular understanding of it. So in any event, I think it's taken us a while to recognize what neoliberalism is, what it's about, how it operates. And then beyond that, neoliberalism hasn't been very forthcoming or very eager to be brazen about some of its aims and about some of the ways that it would actually make us into things like entrepreneurs of ourselves and in a way cheapen much of our lives. So it's taken us a while to catch up. The book is subtitled Exposing the Spirit of Our Age. I think that might put it best, to pay attention to neoliberalism, what it says its aims are, and then to ways in which it hasn't met some of its central promises. So that's a little bit about why I think it's taken us some time to catch up with it.
And we're going to go into a few more questions in a minute, but I said before, I'm really interested in the cover design. And then also I want to just pause in the action and ask you more of an autobiographical type question. What was it that led you to this per se? And then I'm going to get into some of the other questions that are par for the course today. But this cover design with that very striking image. Why that, Rodney? I don't know if you had any role in the cover design, but what?
Well, actually, I did. As you mentioned at the outset, I am an editor and have been responsible for creation of hundreds of books over the years. And I looked for images that might, in my mind, capture something of or symbolize part of what I'm trying to get after in the book. And I think that I searched for an image with octopus and gears, and believe it or not, the image you're holding up came up. I found it via Google, and it struck me very much because neoliberalism is very tentacular. It's very much like an octopus. It has its arms and everything. And the gears to me represented the idea that the workings of society and of our lives can be understood or represented its gears. So the octopus, and I don't mean to slander octopi, but the octopus, has its tentacles in everything. So that's where the image came from. And the people at Fortress liked the image. And then they very nicely designed a cover including it.
Yeah.
So
So,
I'm fond of the cover too.
yes, it's very imaginative, alluring, and it kind of draws you in with all those tentacles. So you're kind of drawn in from every angle in the bookstore and such. So moving further into it, again, what led you into this before I get into more of the apocalyptic intervention? What drove you into this subject? You've done a lot of work in this kind of cultural critique moment, but why this particular book? How did this arise for you?
Well, to back up a ways, gosh, it's been about 25 years ago or 20 years ago. I was asked by Christianity Today to do a major lengthy article on consumerism. And so I read a lot. I had already done some reading on consumerism, but I read a lot more and traveled to 4 or 5 different places, met with a lot of people, had a generous grant to fund the research of the article, and then wrote an article for Christianity Today on consumerism, which they named, this wasn't my title, but they named it Does the Devil Take Visa? And so that got me on a track where I already was thinking about consumerism and about the market, about the marketplace, about the way that our lives were so defined by what we could buy, what we could consume, and how in turn we were consumed by it. And so the ways that we looked at ourselves as consumers. At the time, I wasn't thinking of it in terms of neoliberalism. Quite frankly, I was unaware of the term or the conceptuality in any specific way. But I was struck by how so much of our lives were recast in what I would now call neoliberal ways, making us think of ourselves as consumers, so that, for instance, we're no longer patients of doctors, but clients, and people in schools who are learning are no longer students, but educational consumers. And you can take it on down the line and look at
Churchgoers are giving units.
And when we're in between churches, we're church shoppers.
Yeah.
So all these ways that I would now recognize that as a form of neoliberalism or a training of neoliberalism playing out. But anyways, all that to say, I subsequently was asked to speak often on consumerism and did some more writing on consumerism. So I was already primed in that way. And then I don't know about you, Paul, but when I write a book, very often I start out with very broad ideas and inchoate ideas, and they get narrowed down. And so when I started this book, I thought at the very beginning, I thought I was going to talk something about liberalism. But the more I read, the more I realized that the crux of the problem for me was not liberalism as broad as that is, but neoliberalism. And so the idea funneled down and became more precise as I went along and read more. And so those are some things that fed into it. One of the things I do in the book is recognize that we need to talk more specifically and less amorphously about consumerism and directly address capitalism, and particularly neoliberal capitalism. So I try to do that in the book, and that's another way that it narrowed down and became, I hope, more precise in its focus.
And, just in case the viewer is not familiar with some of these categories, one can be very conservative and still be neoliberal, right? I mean, it's not as if it's some kind of liberal Democrat kind of orientation. again, you mentioned Thatcher and Reagan, and they were the darlings of a new kind of conservative movement back in the day. So
Yes, it's been a bipartisan movement in terms of
exactly.
Democratic and Republican parties.
Back to
And
the tentacles, back to the back.
yeah, yeah. So with Reagan and Thatcher and other subsequent conservatives, but then with Bill Clinton, who
Tony Blair too.
and Tony Blair, and Clinton in particular looked at financialization, and that's another aspect of neoliberalism, how so much of the economy gets wrapped up in finance, no longer in what we materially produce, but on making money out of money, and usually other people's money. So Clinton, opened up the door to deregulation of finance and the financial markets, and decimated the Glass-Steagall Act, which constrained how banks could get into finance and how much they might be concerned with it. So it has been bipartisan, and even Barack Obama, when he looked at education, he looked at it in terms of market competition, and said that we want to have a merit-based understanding of education, and we will reward schools and students who merit it. And apparently other schools who aren't competing as well can be left out in the cold. So it has been, as you indicate, Paul, quite bipartisan.
Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight something because Rodney, you're in addition to being a theologian of the church, someone who is really good at synthesizing the theological and practical. You're a real cultural critic. You have a book on Johnny Cash and American religion scene, culture scene. But that movie The Laundromat, I don't know if you've seen it, but with Meryl Streep and Gary Oldman, dealing with, making money off of money the way they do it. It's a fascinating culture critique type of thing. So it's in so many contexts, and I appreciate knowing a bit more of the story of it, and then also how you tied in. It's a equal opportunity offender or rewarder, both conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats. It's that octopus thing with the tentacles drawing us in from various angles. So what do you mean by calling for an apocalyptic intervention? An apocalyptic intervention in confronting neoliberalism? I know you don't mean by that doom and gloom. So could you unpack what you mean by apocalyptic and an apocalyptic intervention?
Well, as you know, Paul, because you've read the book, I start out in the first chapter by talking about liberalism and the kind of the backstory of where we are now and of what neoliberalism grew out of. And so I call that chapter After Liberalism. Then the second chapter talks about the very special case, or the special case, of neoliberalism, and tries to unpack neoliberalism in at least some detail. The third chapter of the book then, which is kind of the central and a pivotal chapter for the book, is called After Apocalypse, and begins to turn to how do we respond to and engage neoliberalism, particularly as the church and as Christians. So in that chapter, what my argument is that we live in times that are apocalyptic. This is no surprise to anyone. So much of our films, speaking of popular culture, so many of our films and television are about zombies and about breakdown of social structures, and can we survive after that? And we speak constantly in apocalyptic terms in our news. It's a diet of it. We're looking at it ecologically. Certainly COVID has heightened our sense of epidemics or pandemics and what they may mean and how they may mean or could mean a death knell of life as we know it. And we can go on down the line. We seem to careen from one crisis to another. And very often these are put or presented in apocalyptic terms as doom and gloom, as the world collapsing. Now, what I argue in the book is that we may be tempted to say we've got enough apocalypse, so let's turn away from it as best we can. Let's try to ignore it or avert it in some way or another. But what I argue as a Christian theologian is that instead we should out-apocalypse the apocalypses. We should return to the original apocalyptic, namely the death and the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so I rely largely on the Apostle Paul and his understanding that we live in at the turn of the ages, and that actually began with Christ's intervention in history and his life and death and resurrection. So as many of our viewers will be aware, apocalyptic thought originated in Judaism before the turn from to the Common Era or AD, and was understood as a way of seeing the world through, if you will, a heavenly lens. And the Jews that originated apocalyptic thought lived in a world where they were in exile and where their cultural and spiritual lives were threatened. And yet they said God has not ultimately left us behind. God is intervening and will intervene. And of course, Paul said that happened. That has happened in the coming of Christ, and Christ has set us on a new trajectory. And so I say in the book that if we look to the original apocalyptic, we may as Christians find a way by centering ourselves on what it means for Jesus Christ to have come for the salvation of the world, indeed of the cosmos, and how that might help us to understand economy in a deeper and a wider way than neoliberalism. And also have the benefit of helping us to face these other apocalypses that are often thrown in our faces.
So with that, I believe you allude to Colossians with the whole thrust of disarming the principalities and powers, correct? And how Christ does that on the cross. So very much of an apocalyptic orientation there, and how the church participates in that theodrama, that apocalyptic framing of all of life as an exile community, so to speak, belonging to a different age, the age that's in breaking. And I think, when we consider the church, not to look at the church by way of an audience or spectators or giving units or church shoppers, but really God's kingdom community, those whom Christ has bought at the price of his own life, blood. It causes the church, it helps us to see the church not as some privatized entity, but really a public engaging other publics. I know for you, your whole theological orientation, as I understand it, is seeing the church as that alternative kingdom community, not the kingdom community of neoliberalism, but of Christ's kingdom. It is the remnant community of Christ's kingdom, so that is what you often find in discussions of, global civil society, regardless of where we might fall into play with that or where we'd fall on the spectrum of that. But there is something that in those discussions, there's a concern that so often, whether it's the state or the market, there is not an entity or entities that mediate the individual to the state or to the market. And what the church does in part, and I'm not saying that ultimately it's to function as a global civil society nonprofit entity. It's far more than that. But the church does mediate or cushion or, in a sense, protect the individual or the community of people from the onslaught of that ideology with a different kind of imagination, a theopolitical imagination, to use the language of one of your friends and colleagues, William Kavanaugh. Is what I'm saying resonating with what you're trying to do at all? Or is this like,
Oh,
let's
no,
move
very
on,
much.
Paul, let's move on?
Oh, no, it does resonate. It does resonate. And I think the church is at the center. And certainly it is, as I tried to argue in my earlier book, A Peculiar People. It is a culture, in a sense, a way of life. It provides us with the language. It provides us with others. Not only a vocabulary, but a grammar, a way of putting words together. And so we learn about grace. We learn about sin. We learn about what it means to be interdependent on one another. Christ says that Paul says that we are members of one body. And so, as I say in Naming Neoliberalism, none of the New Testament letters are written to a state or a nation state. They are written to churches, particular churches, and who hold together and relate to one another. So that very much resonates. I think one of my biggest complaints about some renderings of Christianity in modernity, and indeed the dominant renderings, are the privatization of Christianity and the individualization of Christianity. So it's all about, you may know that Tom T. Hall song, Me and Jesus, we got our own thing going. Me and Jesus, we got it all worked out. Don't need anybody to tell us what it's all about. As if we aren't connected to other people, and as if we aren't a part of a body that is called Christ. And so that privatization of Christianity is also that there's the individualization, which I've just referred to, and then there's privatization, which says Christianity has nothing to do with public life. And I'm very much with you in wanting to affirm that the church is the face of Christianity's public life.
Immanuel Kant, I mean, I remember talking to Peter Casarella about this once, that, when I look at Kant in, I think it's his What is Enlightenment essay, dare to think for yourself. As I see him, he definitely puts a major line of distinction or division between the private and the public, and how the church in its private sphere and the scholar, who's the priest or the pastor in the private domain of the church. The church is the private. In the public, he can do a different thing, or she can do a different thing with the biblical text. But there's that strong line of separation between the private and public sphere, and how the church belongs to the private. Very much, I think, in keeping with an Enlightenment doctrine, which is precursor to much of neoliberalism as I see it, but in certain trajectories. But I just think this is a fascinating exploration. And as we come to a conclusion today, in terms of, some concrete examples, you've already alluded to some with language and such. When I think about hope, how does the church engender, as a concrete example, how does the church, or how do we as Christians, not buy into the neoliberal gospel, but the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we don't buy into it, we live into it? How does that shape our concept of hope? You talked about eschatology, the doctrine of the future, that we're made for more than this. We're made for more than this neoliberal rendition, because it's not fulfilling what it promises. Like you had said, it's like it promised so much, but then why is all this scarcity coming into play? So how does the church's vision with the apocalyptic inbreaking of Christ's kingdom, how does that shape us to have the courage to hope anew, to live into a different story, the biblical story? And where should we go from here? Your thoughts about that, Rodney?
Yeah, it's hard for me to keep that concise, Paul, because that's the latter half of the book. And one of the things I argue in the first chapter is that gets into that, and responding to neoliberalism, is that we need to understand that in the gospel, We have a bigger story than neoliberalism story. As much like an octopus as it is, as tentacular as it is, neoliberalism, in comparison to the gospel, offers a much smaller and less promising economy. Um, and I talk about the book of Ephesians, Paul, where the Apostle Paul argues that in Christ we see a new economy for our lives. Now, in most of our English versions, it's more prosaically put as a plan for our lives. But Paul uses the Greek term oikonomia, which means economy. And so this bigger economy encompasses all of life, encompasses and faces down death, and indeed is about all of the cosmos and a new creation being brought into existence. And so that's where I think we start, is by recognizing that although neoliberalism promises so much in terms of the economy, we have to recognize there is such a thing as an Orthodox Christian economy that includes markets, but has a place for the spiritual, has a place for the moral, has a place for that which we don't want to put prices on. And so we say that our relationships to our family, to our dearest friends, are priceless. And indeed, even with art, we recognize that it really is hard to put a price on artworks. It really is difficult to say that a Monet is 10 times as more valuable as a Rembrandt, for example. So we recognize that there is a place for the priceless, for truth, for beauty, for goods that can't be named properly, at least, and operate fully and flourish under the neoliberalism economy, which is comparatively stunted. And beyond that, I think that we put into practice as best we can different ways that we share in our lives. The family is actually a communal body, and within families we share, we provide out of the common purse, if you will, for the good of our spouses and our children and our other relatives. And we provide when there is a place for that. And the early church saw itself as just such a family and reached out spiritually, but also saw itself accountable materially and looked to brothers and sisters to serve them in that way. So I think that we need to strengthen the ways in which our churches can operate in the wider economy of the of God, and put those into practice, and not just put them into practice, but continue to do that, because we're already doing that. So we can, as ordinary Christians, we can look to ways that we can share with our neighbors, and particularly our Christian neighbors, share goods, and ways that we can, if you will, promote that and strengthen that and structure that. I think we can also look to communities that have sometimes a more radical witness in those regards. One of them I mentioned in the book is the Bruderhof, and which has branches in New York and Pennsylvania and other places. And the Bruderhof lives together with a common purse, as indeed has monasticism down through the centuries. And so I think we need to look to these already existing forms of witness and see what we can learn from them and grow out of them.
So many implications. And, as you were sharing, Rodney, I was thinking about still other aspects where your book has import. We talked about immigrants earlier and merit-based immigration, how dominant that thrust is rather than the family, rather than the need. And when I think about the orphan, the widow, the alien in their distress, they are invaluable. It's not just the noble for Aristotle, as Aristotle saw, the noble, the virtuous. Christian friendship looks very different than it would on an Aristotelian model. Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, the agape feast, the well-to-do not sharing with those with less. And it was all, a fear of scarcity, not living into the economy of God's abundance, not sharing, or even what he says in 1 Corinthians 11 about those we take to be not as important or not to be taken as seriously. They're indispensable. And I think the gospel, the church, doesn't operate by way of the world's sense of significance. All the talk about significant leaders, significant churches, I'm going, what gospel is that? I mean, it's the upside down kingdom looks very different. The apocalyptic vision of Jesus of Nazareth. And Rodney, as always, I appreciate so very much your prophetic calling, your academic, literary calling, both in theology and ethics and cultural engagement. It's always a joy to interact with you at New Wine, New Wineskins and our journal Cultural Encounters. And you have an article that is coming out in our next issue related to your book, Naming Neoliberalism. So I just want to bring it to your attention again, Naming Neoliberalism, Exposing the Spirit of Our Age by my good friend, my own editor, Rodney Clapp. Rodney, thank you so much for your time today and joining us at New Wine Tastings.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a delight.
And thanks to all of you who are watching this. For Rodney Clapp, I'm Paul Louis Metzger. Thank you for joining us. Blessings to you in your own journey beyond neoliberalism into the apocalyptic reimagination through Jesus of Nazareth in the church. All the best. Goodbye.